to that. And then I want to move to the state of California. There's so many things out of California. I know most of you are not California listeners, but that's good. You might just want to say, let's leave some of the insanity in California and not export it to the rest of the country. But let me come back to this issue here in USA Today. First of all, it says traitor. Few words are so defined so narrowly in law and used so commonly in anger, from politics to the playground. Now, of course, every nation has its infamous traitor. They talk about some. In Norway, it's Vadkum Quisling, the Nazi collaborator. In Britain, of course, it's Kim Kilby. And, of course, in the United States, you can't mention traitor without mentioning Benedict Arnold, of course, who was a Continental Army officer who plotted to turn West Point over to the Redcoats in the Revolutionary War. And so they go on to say that after the news conference on Monday, the term is being used in relation to Donald Trump. You had all sorts of people making these kinds of statements, and I appreciate the fact that at least there were some individuals that were interviewed by Rick Hampson, who's the one that wrote this article, who at least tried to say, wait a minute, these words have meanings, and we're going to get into that in just a minute when we talk about the conversation between Tucker Carlson and Rand Paul. Because he said, when I think traitor, at least one of these individuals, an individual at Catholic University, I think Benedict Arnold. There was evidence, letters, and witnesses. To use a term so loosely discredits people, we should be more careful. And so you can go through some of this, but again, I recognize that some people are going to use the word ill-advisedly in a tweet, in a comment, maybe even an interview. But one that we're going to focus a little attention on is the former CIA director, John Brennan, who wrote on Twitter that Trump's news conference commentary rises and exceeds the threshold of high crimes and misdemeanors. It was nothing short of treasonous. Well, I'm going to come back to Mr. Brennan in just a minute. He knows a little bit about the other side. He has admitted that, although some people, as a matter of fact, one member of Congress called him a communist, and I think Sebastian Gorky called him a communist, but, John Brennan has admitted that he voted for the president of Communist Party. So, anyway, we'll talk about that in just a minute. But Thomas Friedman, another person in positions of responsibility, writing for the New York Times, said, again, the president is deliberately or through gross negligence or because of his own twisted personality engaged in treasonous behavior. And yesterday I mentioned on the New York Daily News a page that said treason as well. So I think it's important to recognize that, first of all, we as a country and as a constitution have really tried to define treason narrowly. Why so? Well, I think just what you've just seen. Anytime somebody doesn't like what you've done, well, they're treasonous. They're a traitor. They're a traitor to America, whatever it might be. And, of course, the reason it was narrowly defined in America is by the time you get to the 18th century, especially in England, the crown, that is the king, could really define anybody's act, in almost any act, as treasonous and as an enemy of the crown, and so as a result, a reason for execution. And we've seen how that played out even before the 18th century in other situations. And so looking at that circumstance in the 18th century, when our Constitution was written, there were attempts to recognize that you might have a treasonous individual in office, but that it would have to be something that would have a very high bar in order to make sure that it wasn't misused. And this goes on for some period of time here in the USA Today article, but I do love at the very end here, Larry Schweikert, who's been on the program with us many times before, he does get a mention near the end. He said, Trump isn't the traitor, the FBI is. So I did love that little dig in real quickly. And so that's an issue that we need to address. And last night, of course, Senator Rand Paul was asked about John Brennan, and he was on talking about the comments about him being treasonous. And the setup, interestingly enough, came from Tucker Carlson. Tucker Carlson said, quote, the former director of the CIA, you would think of that as a sober-minded person, a responsible person, kind of a James Bond with maybe an advanced degree. Here you have a naked partisan nutcase, that was pretty strong, Tucker, describing a press conference as treason. And so here's the response from Senator Rand Paul. He said, it makes me wonder whether he should be getting a government pension if he's going to be disrespecting the commander-in-chief, calling the president treasonous. This is about as over the top as you can get. And Tucker Carlson brought up something which I think whenever you hear somebody saying, well, this is treason or this is a traitor, there is a penalty for treason in America, and it's called what? The death penalty. And even, again, to give credit to USA Today, they've got a couple of stories in here. Of course, they have pictures of Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, who were executed as Soviet spies, Aldrich Ames, who's serving a life sentence, and a number of other situations. So there are repercussions to calling somebody a traitor or saying what they have done is treasonous. And if nothing else, Rand Paul concluded by saying, I'm a big believer that we need more checks and balances on those in the intelligence community. James Comey, John Brennan, James Clapper, we need much more surveillance of the watchers. And that is something that is starting to surface in a number of quarters, is that the intelligence community, number one, is supposed to be believed. And Donald Trump's great sin Monday was he said, I'm not sure I believe the Intelligence Committee, or maybe he misspoke. We'll leave that for another conversation, which we had yesterday. But when you have people in the so-called intelligence community who are well known for lying and misrepresenting viewpoints, sometimes we have to figure out how we can have surveillance of the people providing surveillance on us. And so that's what Rand Paul was talking about. And I think it's just a reminder once again that name-calling is a dangerous phenomenon in our country. And it's maybe about time for us to call out individuals that throw around these kinds of labels in such an indiscriminate way, especially when one of those is a former CIA director, especially was one of those individuals is actually a writer for the New York Times. And so my commentary next week is about Nazi name-calling. Comes out on the 26th, which I guess would be, Thursday. And it just goes into some of the history of how those kinds of name-calling have been taking place for really a half a century. And maybe, especially after what took place over the last couple of days, it's time to say, I may disagree with the president, but he's not a traitor. Although I think some people honestly believe that he is. Let's take a break. We'll come back with more right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Your children are facing an onslaught of profanity through the media. Movies are one place where profanity reigns. One survey has been tracking profanity in movies from the first swear word on film, the 1939 Gone with the Wind, to The Wolf of Wall Street, which holds the record with 798 swear words. There has been a 500% increase over these many decades. The Parents Television Council has documented that the fact that the number of expletives on television programs has doubled in just the last decade. Kids and adults use more profanity simply because they hear it more than ever before. So let's start with a definition. The word profane means to treat something that is sacred with abuse or contempt. It means to desecrate. Something profane is unholy. It is certainly not a positive attitude. So what does the Bible teach? Well, Paul says in Ephesians 4:29, do not let any unwholesome talk come out of your mouths, but only what is helpful for building others up according to their needs. Colossians 3:8 says, rid yourselves of all such things as these: anger, rage, malice, slander, and filthy language from your lips. Sometimes we hear young people say that it really doesn't matter what you say, it's only words. Well, words make a difference. Make a joke in public about hijacking a plane and see if words have consequences. As believers, we should submit our vocabularies to the Lord. The world is watching us. Peter admonishes us to keep our behavior excellent among the Gentiles, so that in the thing in which they slander you as evildoers, they may, because of your good deeds, as they observe them, glorify God in the day of visitation. In a world awash in profanity, Christians should watch what they say. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Take Kerby and the Point of View team with you on the go with the Point of View app. Search for Point of View Radio at the Apple or Google Play stores.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Talked about the idea of calling people traitors and treasonous, and occasionally somebody would call Barack Obama that. But by and large, if you look at the history, and that's one of the reasons I did this commentary for next week, most of it comes from liberals calling Republicans or conservatives, whatever it is, traitors, treasonous, Nazis, fascist, whatever. In a few cases, it's gone the other direction, and I'll admit that as well. So if you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. But I want to move our attention to California. If you ever listened to this program, you know that I grew up in that area. I was born in Berkeley, grew up in the San Francisco Bay Area. But even this one's a bit of a head scratcher, and one that I thought we might talk about for just a minute. Andrew and I talked about it yesterday, and it has to do with, this is just one of the stories from the Sacramento Bee, but it's in the San Jose Mercury, it's in the San Francisco Chronicle, and all the rest. Non-citizens legally register to vote in San Francisco school elections. Now, this isn't meaning that if you're not a citizen, you can vote in all elections. But the argument is that, and it's a flimsy argument, but nevertheless, you have your kids in the school, even though you're not a citizen, we're going to allow you to vote. Now, I'm going to just a minute share with you where I think this is going, but let's just again share a little bit of this. San Francisco began registering non-citizens, including undocumented immigrants. Those would be illegal aliens, but that's the way the Sacramento Bee, of course, wants to cover it, and I understand that. And so they're now registering to vote for a November election. Now, if that election takes place the same day as the state and federal elections, you can begin to recognize there's a problem. Theoretically, it's only for the city school board. We'll get back to what that means in just a minute. But again, this follows a move of a ballot measure in which San Francisco voters opened up school elections to non-citizens who are over the age of 18, why there, that's interesting, and have children under age 19. So first of all, there are some limitations. In just a minute, I'm going to get to what that's going to happen and how that's going to play itself out. But what I love is a San Francisco supervisor, Hillary Ronan, said, this is a no-brainer legislation. Really? No-brainer. Why would we not want our parents invested in the education of their children? We want to give immigrants the right to vote. And, of course, that's where they tip their hand, because first it's the school board election, but you can see that the moment this is granted, and that's exactly what's happening, can you not believe that there would be a liberal judge in California, but I repeat myself, that would obviously want to say, wait a minute, we can't just let them vote in only these elections. We cannot allow them to vote only if they have children under the age of 19. Those particular rules and regulations and limitations are discriminatory. And so you can see where this goes very quickly. The illustrations that people like to use, it's, a watershed event, it's camel's nose under the tent. You pick the metaphor. You know where this is going, because pretty soon what you're going to have is, number one, the argument that anybody who is in the country, whether they're here legally or illegally, whether they're a citizen or non-citizen, deserves a right to vote. And this is the first attempt to move in that direction. Now, of course, that also relates to something else we always love to talk about here, and that is if indeed we believe that you should be a citizen and you should have some kind of proof that you're a citizen, then you would need voter ID. But yet we're told all the time that a photo ID in order to vote is discriminatory. And there was at least one judge who actually, even in the state of Texas, struck down a requirement that individuals would have a photo ID to vote. And, of course, if you can find a judge in Texas to do this, how much more likely are you going to find a judge in California to do this? Now, a while back, about a year ago, and you can find it on our website, pointofview.net, you can just type in ID not necessary, ? I did a commentary in which I really went through a very good article that appeared at that time in the Washington Examiner. And they did that because, once again, every time you turn around as we get close to election, voter ID and photo IDs are actually seen as discriminatory. And this article that was in the Washington Examiner actually listed 24 things that require a photo ID. And so that is, I think, pretty interesting to begin to get into, because if you think about this, here's just the short list, and it will wear you out if I go through all of them. You cannot buy alcohol without an ID. If you're under 27 years of age and want to buy cigarettes, you'll be asked an ID in most states. You need an ID to open a bank account. You need an ID to apply for food stamps or to apply for other welfare benefits. You need an ID to apply for Medicaid. You need an ID to apply for Social Security. You need an ID to apply for a job. You need an ID to apply for unemployment. You need an ID to rent or buy a house. You need an ID to apply for a mortgage to buy that house. You need an ID to rent a car or to actually buy a car. Of course, you also need a driver's license to drive a car, but that's another thing. You need an ID to get on an airplane. You need an ID to get married. You need an ID to buy a gun. You need an ID to apply for a hunting license. You need an ID to apply for a fishing license. You need an ID to rent a hotel room. You need an ID to buy a cell phone. You need an ID to pick up a prescription. You even sometimes need an ID to pick up certain cold medications. You need an ID to give a blood transfusion. But we're told by our friends that you don't need an ID to vote. Really? We can see where this is going, and San Francisco may be just an anomaly. Let's hope that it is, but already we have non-citizens actually legally registered to vote. And the only limitations are you have to be over the age of 18 and you have to have a child under the age of 19. And do you not know there's probably at least one liberal judge or many liberal judges, not to mention in the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeal, that will want to strike both of those as well? Why age 18 to vote? And more importantly, why only allow people that have children under the age of 19 to vote in that election? Because after all, their tax dollars are going for it. You can see where this is going. It just does not take much time at all to actually conclude that we are headed towards a time in which anybody at any time of any age, whether they're citizens or not, can vote. And the only thing to stop it is to know where your candidates who are running for office stand on those issues, and also hope that we have candidates who, when they are able to actually have an influence on the judiciary, prevent those kinds of judges from getting on that particular bench, or in some cases, and by the way, since most of my listeners here in the state of Texas, although I know some of you are up there in Minnesota, I was at a meeting the other day where I had a chance to hear from quite a number of judges that were running, and these were in Collin County, which is in the north, but I've also lived in Dallas County, and it is striking to find out how many individuals who are running for judge in different races. Some are district judge, some are appellate judge, some are family court judge, some are justice of the peace. But it's amazing how many of these individuals, when rated by the Bar Association, Dallas County Bar Association, Collin County Bar Association, are rated unqualified. When I said that to my wife, she said, well, how can they be allowed to run? Well, again, I don't want to actually prohibit that, because you can imagine how, if you, let's take Dallas County, where most of the individuals are Democratic judges in that office right now. I had a chance to meet a lot of them and my son-in-law's wedding, because he's a lawyer and works with a lot of them. And I've met all sorts of Republican judges in Collin County. But imagine if on one side or the other, there's enough people in the Bar Association that use their political bias against a Republican or a bias against a Democrat to rate somebody as unqualified. I don't think that's happening. But again, we want people at the polls to decide who gets into office or who does not. But the sad reality is, the good news is that there are very good rating agencies. The bad news is most of us as voters don't look at them. And I would suggest to you this time, I was struck by the number of people who are running for a judgeship who were rated as unqualified. How do you get unqualified? Oh, it means, well, maybe you're going to be a judge, but you've never been to law school. Maybe you went to law school, but you didn't graduate. Or maybe you even graduated from law school, but you didn't pass the bar. Or maybe you have zero experience in the courts. If you ever go into a courtroom, wouldn't you like to have a judge that understands what's going on? I think so. So as we have this election coming up, check those qualified and unqualified ratings, I was struck by how many individuals are unqualified. Actually, they're listed as not qualified, but I'll not be politically correct. If you're not qualified, guess what? You're unqualified. You shouldn't be on the bench. Let's take a break. I got a few more things to talk about from California and a couple of the blue states, but we'll have to wait till after the break to cover those. Anytime you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. Also, you can leave a message on Facebook. We'll be back right after this.
Imagine you work where you know people do not share your faith, and they certainly don't agree with a Christian view of life and culture. You are surrounded by hostility every single day. How important would it be to have solid information to back you up? Jim in South Carolina listens to Point of View in the afternoons. He writes, I teach in a public secular university and enjoy actually being a voice for the biblical Christian worldview in a liberal setting. Thank you for your ministry. Thank you for being bold and proclaiming truth. And Jim finishes, I pray for you daily. Jim works in hostile territory, and he prays for Point of View because Point of View is a source of truth. Please help us continue being here for Jim and everyone else. We need you to visit pointofview.net/team or call 1-800-347-5151 and join the Truth Team. Enable us to be here each day by giving each month. 800-347-5151 and pointofview.net/team.
Point of View will continue after this.
You're listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
The General Conversation. If you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. Let me give you a preview of what's going to come up here in the next hour or so. We have Jerry Newcombe with us at 1 o'clock, and that will be a chance to really spend some time talking about some of his commentaries. I love one or two of them. Who died and made the Supreme Court God? 5 reasons I think Roe versus Wade should be overturned, and don't let them bork Brett Kavanaugh. So we'll get into that. We'll talk about some of the human rights abuses. Bob Roberts will talk about what's happening in Burma or Myanmar. I'll talk about, as I already have, what has been happening in Nigeria. And in the third hour, which, again, you can listen to online and is, of course, still on our national program, Jay Cost, The Price of Greatness. I'm going to talk about Alexander Hamilton and James Madison, which I think relate a lot to this whole issue, because Cal Thomas asked the question the other day, which I thought was a good question. Would the Democratic majority or minority at the moment, but a potential majority in the U.S. Senate actually even confirm somebody like Alexander Hamilton? And the answer is probably not, in light of some of the things he wrote in the Federalist Papers. So just some great things to cover, which we will do so in the next couple of hours. But since we were talking about California, I thought I'd pick up one other piece from there and then move on to some of the other blue states, which I'm surprised California has not joined, but maybe they have since I've printed this article out last night. But the one from California, which I thought was so interesting, is on the one hand, we have this move, at least in San Francisco, to allow non-citizens to register to vote. On the other hand, you have some people wondering, well, does my vote even matter anyway? And we've had this situation before. Let's take the broad issue that you had all sorts of states, a couple of dozen states, that define marriage between one man and one woman. And even though these were duly elected representatives who voted those particular rules and regulations in, or else initiative referendum that were voted on, those were overturned by 5 justices of the Supreme Court. Well, you have a similar happening right now in California, which is even more so, because there was an attempt through what's called Proposition 9 to actually split California into 3 states. And I'll talk about whether that makes any sense and what that would look like in a minute. But the bottom line is after that particular initiative and proposition was put on the ballot, because the requisite number of signatures were actually obtained in June to qualify to be on the ballot on November 6th, the California Supreme Court simply struck it down. And the argument wasn't that this was unconstitutional. The argument wasn't that this is inappropriate. The argument wasn't that you don't have the right or authority to do so. The justices simply wrote, well, we conclude that the potential harm in permitting the measure to remain on the ballot outweighs the potential harm in delaying the proposition to a future election. And so they simply directed the Secretary of State in California to refrain from placing Proposition 9 on the upcoming ballot. Now, in case you are not kind of split California into 3 Californias, it is something that many people have talked about before, and there's actually a campaign called Cal 3, so you can see it as well. But the reason for it comes back to kind of some of the things we just talked about a minute ago, and that is since California has now become basically a one-party state, there are not only Democrats that rule the Assembly and the Senate, and, of course, the governor's mansion, but these are essentially veto-proof majorities. And so as a result, whatever individuals in Sacramento say goes. And, of course, we were also seeing here whatever the San Francisco supervisors say goes. And so there are some that are saying, wait a minute, California is a really big state, and there are individuals that are on Silicon Valley that may have one kind of need and situation and maybe even governance. We have those in the Central Valley that are agricultural, and they have very different kinds of needs and different kind of political philosophies. So the idea was to actually break California down into either 3 states, or at one point there was a proposal to break them down into 6 states, but that one was supposed to be put on the ballot back in 2014 and did not get the required number of signatures. But nevertheless, under this proposal, because California is so big, each one of the, quote, states in which California would be broken into three would have about 12 to 13 million people. You would have what would be called California, and that would be Los Angeles County, Ventura County, Santa Barbara, San Luis Obispo, Monterey, San Benito counties. Then you'd have one that would be called Southern California, and that would be San Diego, San Bernardino, Orange County, which is fairly conservative, Tulane, Fresno County, Kings, Kearns, and whatever. And then you would have what would be called Northern California, which would include San Francisco and all the counties north of Sacramento. I'm not sure that would help conservatives all that much, but it certainly would allow some individuals to make a difference. But the point I'm making is that even with the fact that they got the requisite number of signatures to put this proposition on the ballot, all it took was the California Supreme Court to say, nope, we're not going to vote on it. And that was the end of that. And so you can see why more and more people are saying, why do I even want to vote if indeed one justice or a few judges or the Supreme Court or the California Supreme Court or the Texas Supreme Court or the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals can overturn what we were able to achieve either by an initiative and referendum or achieve by having our duly elected representatives represent our viewpoint. So we won't spend a lot more time talking about California, but I thought I'd move to one other issue before we take a break, and that is we have a number of other blue states, New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, Maryland, that have now filed a lawsuit because, as you might remember, when we had the Tax Reform Act that was passed by Congress, one of the things that was eliminated is the fact that these blue states, which have very high state income taxes, actually were able to get a state income tax deduction. And so as a result, the Attorney General in the state of New York said, we just filed suit to protect New Yorkers from the federal government's unconstitutional tax law, which drastically cuts the state and local tax deduction. New York will not be bullied. That's the latest Twitter post here. And the argument is that it would cost those individuals in some of these blue states where their state taxes are so high a little bit more in taxes because no longer would they get a deduction from that. So how do we think about this from a constitutional point of view? Well, let me just quote from Ed Morrissey. Need to get him on again. But nevertheless, he said the federal legislature capping a federal tax deduction evenly applied across all 50 states is 100% constitutional. New Yorkers and residents of a handful of liberal northeastern states who signed on to the silliness, he says, enjoy no constitutional right to have any particular portion of their state and local taxes eligible to defray the federal tax bill. A specific quote from Ed Morrissey says, there's nothing in the Constitution that requires the federal government to reimburse the cost of state taxes, which are, after all, entirely within the control of the state. So think about this for just a minute. Something would be unconstitutional if you were to say, look, the state of Maryland or the state of California has to pay more taxes per person than someone else on the federal government. Well, that would be unconstitutional because you didn't have equal protection. But what this does is just the opposite. It simply says that no longer any state, whether you have a state income tax or you don't have a state income tax, whether you have a high state income tax, a low state income tax, or no income tax, nobody gets a deduction for that. There is no way that this lawsuit goes anywhere, but in the state of New York, apparently it does for a while. Philip Klein, also has been with us as well, said this is a completely idiotic lawsuit. The idea that limiting a federal tax deduction in any way that applies equally to all states is a violation of state sovereignty is absurd. So we can go through some of the other comments and quotes and all those kinds of things as well. But nevertheless, what you really, in a sense, have happening right now is individuals, primarily the attorney generals, but also some of those in these positions where Democrats are in a majority in New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, and Maryland, that insist that rich people in their states should get special treatment. Because I think it is important to mention that, again, there is a deduction. It's a cap of $10,000 on deductions in all states. Now, eventually it will be eliminated entirely, but the bottom line is that really this is even more unlikely to go forward because it's only those states which have an income tax and only those states which have an exorbitant state income tax who have individuals that exceed $10,000 cap on deductions. If you're paying more than $10,000 in state income taxes because the percentages are pretty low, you probably are making a lot of money, and you probably do not need the kind of tax relief that they're calling for. Let's take a break. We've got a lot more to cover. We'll do that right after this.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. Evelyn Shatkin, Linda Shiflett, and Doug Maples took prayer seriously. So seriously, in fact, that they decided to meet together after work and pray for a colleague that had been causing them problems. They met at the cubicle of their colleague after work on a day that she was not even in the office. Their prayer got pretty serious. They anointed the cubicle with oil, according to Shatkin's religious tradition. They prayed for peace and joy for their colleague. They even commanded demons to leave their colleague as they prayed. Word got back to the supervisors about the after-hours prayer meeting, and after an investigation, the supervisor concluded that, quote, the nature, the manner that they're praying, what language they're using, determines whether the prayer was harassment. Human Resources agreed and notified the prayer givers that they would be terminated for their harassing prayers. Shatkin and Shiflett asked for a religious accommodation for the prayers, but that was denied. They were fired. First Liberty Institute took up their case. A federal district court sided with the employees as it concluded, quote, can a prayer for someone constitute harassment when the alleged object of the prayer is unaware of it? This court suspects not, unquote. In fact, the court concluded that the college's own policies protected the prayers of these employees. Firing someone for their peaceful exercise of religion at work doesn't have a prayer. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
You can learn how to protect religious freedom in the workplace, public schools, your church, the military, and more by downloading First Liberty's free Religious Liberty Protection Kits at firstliberty.org. That's firstliberty.org. If you want hope for religious freedom, go to firstliberty.org.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
For this hour, we've looked a little bit at California. We looked at some of the blue states like New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, Maryland. And you might say, well, I live in the state of Texas, or I live in the state of Minnesota, where we broadcast during this hour. And you might say, well, that doesn't really affect me. Well, it does in the sense that certainly very quickly some of these issues become national issues. And the best way to illustrate that is to look at what we'll be talking about in just a few minutes, and I know we'll be talking about on Friday, and that is the confirmation hearings for Brett Kavanaugh, an individual that has served with distinction as a judge in the D.C. Circuit Court, individual that was first nominated in 2003 and was not confirmed to 2006. Did you hear me there? I mean, he was nominated in 2003, 3 years later, almost 3 years later to the day, with some tense negotiations, finally the Democrats said, okay, we'll consider the nomination of him to the D.C. court, where he's been, of course, ever since, until now being thrust from there to a national spotlight as the next Supreme Court nominee. And we can see that the reaction from those individuals in the media, and I want to focus more attention, the interaction and the reactions from those individuals that are part of what I call the Democratic Five. These are the 5 people most likely to run against Donald Trump 2 years from now. We can see that they are just apoplectic. They're engaging in hyperbole. They're making all sorts of statements. They are saying it is the end of the republic as we know, the end of democracy as we know. And I thought I might read one or two of the quotes just to give you a sense of what they are. We put this in an appeal letter coming out, so if you have a chance to get that in the mail, I would encourage you to read it. One of those so-called Democratic Five is Cory Booker. You might say, who? Yeah, that's part of his problem. He is a senator from New Jersey, probably not exactly well known, but nevertheless hopes that he could be the next Barack Obama, African-American in background, so hopes that maybe lightning will strike once again. But he said our next justice should be a champion for protecting and advancing rights, not rolling them back. But Kavanaugh has a long history of demonstrating hostility towards defending the rights of everyday Americans. Not true, but that's what he's going to say, and you're not going to get him to change it because, after all, he wants to win the Democratic nomination for president. Bernie Sanders, you remember him, right? Okay, not technically a Democrat, technically an independent, but basically caucuses with the Democrats. And he tweeted, for example, if Brett Kavanaugh is confirmed to the Supreme Court, it will have a profoundly negative effect on workers' rights, women's rights, voting rights for decades to come. We must do everything we can to stop this nomination. I'm a little concerned with do everything because sometimes there's no limit to what some individuals want to do in that regard. And again, part of the point, Ann Coulter in a piece talks about the fact that these senators really are so concerned about rights, but if anything, senators are the ones that are supposed to protect the rights. So if they really think that's a problem, they can pass all sorts of legislation that protects individuals' rights. But the point is they really don't necessarily talk about rights that you and I would talk about. What she says is what the left is so hysterical about is they run to the courts to win their most popular policy ideas, which are unpopular with the American people, and get those unpopular policy ideas gift-wrapped and handed to them by liberal courts as constitutional rights. And so you have on MSNBC Senator Elizabeth Warren saying that people storming into the streets and making their voices heard about Kavanaugh is the remarkable part of our democracy. But I love Ann Coulter saying, actually, it isn't democracy at all. Liberals don't do well at democracy because if indeed they felt that democracy was the way to go, why aren't they out there? And you can use all sorts of examples, running for office, promising to ban the death penalty, promising to ban assault weapons, promising to implement, although now they're starting to talk about a $15 an hour minimum wage, or maybe to even enshrine late-term abortion, you name it. There are all sorts of issues, and the reason is they know that those are, back to our point, unpopular policy positions. And if anything, the reality is that whenever individuals using the democratic values try to bring about change, they're overruled by the court. And we've seen this happening in California. We're seeing this happening in all sorts of places. And Ann Coulter uses one example. She says gay marriage, for example, was foisted on the country not through ballot initiatives, persuasion, public acceptance, lobbying, or politicians winning elections by promising to legalize it. No, what happened was in 2003, the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court suddenly discovered a right to gay marriage lurking in the Constitution of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, which was written by John Adams. Surprise, she says. After that, the people rose up and banned gay marriage in state after state, even in liberal bastions like California and Oregon. The year after the Massachusetts court's remarkable discovery, gay marriage lost in all 11 states where it was on the ballot. Everywhere gay marriage was submitted to a popular vote, and it lost. Only one state voters briefly seemed to approve of gay marriage, Arizona in 2006, but that was evidently a problem with the wording of the initiative because 2 years later, the voters overwhelmingly approved a constitutional ban on gay marriage. She goes on to say, inasmuch as allowing people to vote resulted in a resounding no on gay marriage, liberals ran back to the courts. Still, the public rebelled. A year after the Iowa Supreme Court concocted a right to gay marriage, voters recalled 3 of the court's 7 justices. A handful of blue state legislatures passed gay marriage laws, but even in New York, the gay marriage bill failed in 2009. And then the U.S. Supreme Court decided it was quite enough to have democracy on the question of gay marriage, and it turned out that just like the Massachusetts Constitution, gay marriage as a clause was hiding in our Constitution all along. Of course, she's using a fair amount of sarcasm there, but you get the point, and that is whenever you hear people that are calling for democracy, who then are expecting the courts to enact their laws, we can see that that's the problem. We have a judiciary that sometimes is doing the things that are not popular with the American people. And that's why you're going to hear such a hue and cry. And we'll talk about this in the next hour with the whole question of the confirmation hearings of Brett Kavanaugh. And I suspect when we get Penna Dexter and Kelly Shackelford here tomorrow, you'll really hear about it from them as well. Just before we go, let me just mention that there is a piece of legislation that's gotten real controversial in Israel, and it shouldn't be, and that is where Israel simply declares itself as a Jewish state. Who would have thought? I mean, after all, more individuals there are Jewish than anything else. That's how it was created in the first place. And it also declares Jerusalem as an eternal capital. This comes from a Newswire. The government says the bill passed in the early morning hours will merely enshrine into law Israel's existing character. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu called the passage a historic moment in the history of Zionism and in the history of the state of Israel. The legislation, by the way, also addresses Jerusalem's status, declaring that Jerusalem is complete and united and is the capital of Israel, which, by the way, is something, of course, that the Trump administration has said as well. The opponents, by the way, say that it marginalizes the country's Arab minority, which is about 20%, and also downgrades the Arab language. But again, if indeed this is a Jewish country, then the first language is Hebrew by definition, any more than if you're in Japan, the language is Japanese. But if you want to speak English, that's fine. And if you're in Germany, well, it's German. It's just the way it is. But nevertheless, we will hear over the next couple of weeks how this is once again evidence of discrimination in Israel. But I think it's something that probably should have been done at least a few decades ago, but has now been done to establish, number one, that Israel is a Jewish state, which of course it is, and number two, that Jerusalem is the capital, and now the United States recognizes the capital of Israel in Jerusalem. When we come back, we're going to be talking with our good friend Jerry Newcombe. He's written a number of commentaries, and we have those on our website, and we welcome your phone calls if you have some comments. 1-800-351-1212. We'll be right back.
Is religious freedom still a cornerstone of the republic, or has it effectively been crushed by the forces of tolerance? America needs Christians to be informed and as unified as possible, applying God's wisdom to civic life. Point of view can be a key part of a successful mission. I believe in America. I believe God wants His best for us. We can face whatever the world throws at us as long as we stand together. If you have not signed on, please do it now. Support Point of View Radio today at pointofview.net. Set up your monthly gift by clicking the Truth Team 360 picture and then carefully follow the directions. Pointofview.net. By phone, you can give at 1-800-347-5151. 800-347-5151. Or mail that first donation to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221. Box 30, Dallas 75221. Or call us 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. We're going to be talking with our good friend Jerry Newcombe. He's got a number of columns that have come out over the last couple of weeks. Who Died and Made the Supreme Court God? Just love that one, and we'll get into that, especially as we talk about the confirmation hearings coming up with Brett Kavanaugh. 5 reasons I think Roe versus Wade should be overturned, and those are on our website. And then a more recent one, Don't Let Them Bork Brett Kavanaugh. So those are some topics that will certainly set us up for the confirmation hearings. And, of course, also give you a chance to join the conversation today, 1-800-351-1212. Jerry Newcombe is, of course, a weekly columnist. You can read him at Town Hall, Christian Post, Newsmax, WorldNet Daily. Of course, he has been with D. James Kennedy's ministry all these various years, author of such books with Dr. Kennedy as What If Jesus Had Never Been Born, with Dr. Lilleback, George Washington's Sacred Fire, and just all sorts of other great resources. An individual that also has his own radio program, also, of course, has done all sorts of specials for D. James Kennedy Ministries. And Jerry Newcombe, just kind of amazing when you're walking through the Reagan National Airport, who you run into.
Yeah. That was so great to see you last week. I appreciated it. It was amazing.
I know. You were actually there in Washington, D.C., doing some presentations on something we'll talk about in a minute, Saul Alinsky. And I was just flying through. I'd actually come from New York. I had been up there in Vermont, New York, and was flying through, and there we are. And so it's always fun to run into you. But let's get into it, because we don't have a lot of time, and that is, I love your piece, Who Died and Made the Supreme Court God? And what you're really saying is that so many times when individuals on the left cannot pass particular pieces of legislation through a state legislature or through Congress, they've come to depend upon the Supreme Court or other courts and other justices to take unpopular policy positions and then declare them as constitutional rights. Tell us more.
Yeah, and so basically what they're doing is taking the power of we the people out of our hands. The founders gave us a situation where they recognized that our rights come from God, and so it was the duty of government to basically acknowledge those rights. We're not given the right to freedom and the right to life and all those things because the Constitution gives us those powers. No. The founders recognized these are self-evident truths. These are rights that are independent of themselves. But the goal of the whole United States government was to give us a framework by which we could live out those God-given unalienable rights. What's happened instead, though, is with the judicial activism, the problem where courts are taking it upon themselves to essentially create laws, out of whole cloth, when they're not really assigned to do that. They're assigned to adjudicate, not to legislate from the bench. And so a perfect example of that is Roe v. Wade, where in 1973, the Supreme Court, with 2 decisions, both coming out the same day, Roe v. Wade and Doe v. Bolton, that you very rarely hear about, give us abortion on demand essentially through all 9 months. And somebody might say, well, Roe v. Wade makes a big deal about the first trimester, and that's what it's all about. Yeah, but the companion decision talks about trimesters 2 and 3 and says basically allows a situation where, well, if a doctor says the woman's health might be at risk, and that's been very loosely interpreted, the effect of it is abortion through all 9 months. And so we have a situation, though, where the Supreme Court for years has been essentially creating new rights that don't exist. They took the issue of marriage a few years ago, and they said, well, marriage in this country, can be between a lesbian couple or a homosexual couple. And of course, in doing that, they took the mooring off, and there's no way in which you could say, well, why can't there be a threesome? Seriously, why can't three people get married? Why can't a man marry his mother, or something like that? I mean, just it gets into grotesque type of situations. But marriage has always been understood for millennia, to use a phrase or a word from Anthony Kennedy, who wrote that decision, which he, was not a good decision at all. But anyway, marriage has been understood as being between a man and a woman, and the Supreme Court had a great deal of hubris, and frankly, I think they overextended their authority in so redefining it. But we have a problem in this country from the Supreme Court for years just throwing out school prayers, saying the Ten Commandments can't be on the schoolroom wall. The kids might read them and obey them. Can't have that. And, they've given us abortion on demand. They opened the floodgates of pornography, and they've redefined marriage, and it just goes on, and that's just not the way the founders intended it to be. Even in those decisions where Americans may disagree with each other, we, the people, should have the right to decide for ourselves, whereas with the court, they just took that right out of our hands, and they decided it, and you have 5 unelected lawyers, to use a paraphrase from Scalia, who died a few years ago, but the Supreme Court justice who was conservative, one of the conservatives, he said that 5 elected lawyers make this major, monumental decision, taking that out of the hands of we the people. It's not what the founders intended.
Let me just mention, too, for our listeners that your piece that we've posted on our website, pointofview.net. Of course, we also have a link to your website, jerrynewcombe.com. But again, that piece has a real good summary of, some of these important cases on pornography and prayer, on Bible reading, posting the 10 Commandments, of course, ones we just talked about like abortion, but also the issue of teaching intelligent design and marriage and on and on and on. And so this is just a great resource there. But let me get to another point, and that is the so-called Democratic 5 that I begin to identify, the 5 people that most think they're going to eventually run against Donald Trump. And you have, of course, a quote from Kamala Harris, who's one of those who says this is the destruction of the Constitution of the United States. Cory Booker, who's in New Jersey, says our next justice actually has demonstrated hostility towards defending the rights of Americans. Bernie Sanders, of course, remember him, has actually said that this individual would have a bad effect on so-called women's rights and other issues. Every one of these reactions is due to the fact that they recognize that the court, which they depend upon so often to enact unpopular legislation that they could never get through the Congress, might be fading away, don't you think?
Yeah, I do. And, the interesting thing about that is just even in framing the question you just did, the Kamala Harris quote, as I recall, came after Anthony Kennedy retired. So it was even before a specific name was mentioned. Exactly.
And Chuck Schumer did the same thing. He said the next nominee, and we didn't even know who the next nominee was. Yeah. In 2 cases, they were saying this before or tweeting this before we even knew that it was going to be Brett Kavanaugh.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly. And in fact, the night that Mr. Kavanaugh was, they announced Mr. Kavanaugh as that Mr. President Trump announced him as the Supreme Court nominee. That very night, the liberals had all kinds of different posters made with the 3 finalists. So this Amy Barrett one. No, that's not the right one. It's Brett Kavanaugh. That's the one. This Kethledge one. No, put that aside. That's for next time. Whatever. I mean, it's almost laughable. There was even one article that blasted the nominee, and then it put XXX because they didn't know what the name was going to be.
Pretty sad. So, we'll continue our conversation with Jerry Newcombe right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Your children are facing an onslaught of profanity through the media. Movies are one place where profanity reigns. One survey has been tracking profanity in movies from the first swear word on film, the 1939 Gone with the Wind, to The Wolf of Wall Street, which holds the record with 798 swear words. There has been a 500% increase over these many decades. The Parents Television Council has documented that the fact that the number of expletives on television programs has doubled in just the last decade. Kids and adults use more profanity simply because they hear it more than ever before. So let's start with a definition. The word profane means to treat something that is sacred with abuse or contempt. It means to desecrate. Something profane is unholy. It is certainly not a positive attitude. So what does the Bible teach? Well, Paul says in Ephesians 4:29, do not let any unwholesome talk come out of your mouths, but only what is helpful for building others up according to their needs. Colossians 3:8 says, rid yourselves of all such things as these: anger, rage, malice, slander, and filthy language from your lips. You know, sometimes we hear young people say that it really doesn't matter what you say, it's only words. Well, words make a difference. Make a joke in public about hijacking a plane and see if words have consequences. As believers, we should submit our vocabularies to the Lord. The world is watching us. Peter admonishes us to keep our behavior excellent among the Gentiles, so that in the thing in which they slander you as evildoers, they may, because of your good deeds, as they observe them, glorify God in the day of visitation. In a world awash in profanity, Christians should watch what they say. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Take Kerby and the Point of View team with you on the go with the Point of View app. Search for Point of View Radio at the Apple or Google Play stores.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Jerry Newcombe with us today, and if you'd like to know more about him, we have a link to his website, jerrynewcombe.com. Also posted a couple of articles, one having to do with the Supreme Court, and which he also quotes from James Madison. I might just mention as a program note, in the next hour, we're going to have Jay Cost with us, the new book, The Price of Greatness, Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and the Creation of American Oligarchy. It's going to be a little bit of a history lesson. Of course, we've learned so much history as well from Jerry Newcombe. But Jerry, let's, if we can, move to your other article real quickly, and then maybe also get into the idea of Saul Alinsky and the borking of Brett Kavanaugh. But you mentioned the issue of Roe versus Wade and your piece that came out recently, 5 reasons I think Roe v. Wade should be overturned. That's an important piece because even though maybe not everyone will be asking about how Judge Kavanaugh stands on the issue of abortion, we know that's kind of one of the big issues, isn't it?
Yeah, I think it's the 800-pound gorilla in the room. I think that even the hostility and the terrible things that happened to Robert Bork or to Clarence Thomas, that ultimately abortion lay at the bottom of so much of that. So I did write a column recently, 5 reasons why I think Roe v. Wade should be overturned. If I could just summarize them real fast, 1, it was all based on lies. It was based on, they said this happened and that happened to Roe, and it did not happen. And in fact, later, Roe became a born-again Christian, Norma McCorvey, and even fought against Roe and was very disheartened by the damage that this Supreme Court decision had done, and it was done in her name. But she was willing at first, and then later she became pro-life and changed her position. The second point is no real constitutional basis. Now, that's very critical because it's supposed to be based on the Constitution, but there's a whole section in that about how this is behind his back. People were even calling the decision Harry's abortion because Judge Harry Blackman had written the decision, and even a lot of liberals who say, I agree with the effect of Roe v. Wade, but as a decision, it's so poorly argued and reasoned that it's terrible. It's a terrible example of misusing the Constitution. The third point is abortion hurts women. The fourth point is that it kills millions of unborn babies. 60 million now. And the fifth point, which should say it all, is that God opposes abortion. God opposes the shedding of innocent blood. And so, to me, that reason alone is sufficient. But the heart of the whole column, though, gets back to the specifics about the Constitution and how it really was a misuse of our founding document.
Ruth Bader Ginsburg said as much, so even those who supported the conclusion of abortion nevertheless said it was a poorly reasoned argument, and it really was. But in the interest of time, I want to move on to one that we haven't posted, but we certainly can in the future. Don't let them bork Brett Kavanaugh. And the reason I want to bring that up is you and maybe Robert Knight are the two kind of experts that we like to go to every once in a while to talk about Saul Alinsky. And when we go back to Judge Robert Bork, I recognize that many of our younger listeners, the millennials and things like that, don't remember what happened in 1986 and 1987. Understand that. But you only have to understand the mindset of Saul Alinsky to recognize that there has been always this attempt when you are going after an opponent, whether it is a Supreme Court nominee or a political opponent, to use certain kinds of tools. So educate us about that, if you might.
Sure. Well, Saul Alinsky was a community organizer, and ultimately Barack Obama even went to essentially the school of Saul Alinsky in Chicago. And I mean that in a generic sense. I don't mean that there's a school literally called the Saul Alinsky School. I guess there is a Saul Alinsky Institute. But anyway, he was in that mode and model, and so also was Hillary Clinton. Saul Alinsky essentially shaped their thinking.
Right.
Saul Alinsky wrote a book called Rules for Radicals, which he dedicated, by the way, to Lucifer. Dinesh D'Souza says, he was an atheist, Saul Alinsky was, and therefore even his belief in Lucifer might not have been a real belief. In any event, he, in many ways, bought into totally the Machiavellian philosophy and idea that it's okay to go ahead and lie and tell half-truths or whatever if it advances your cause. The ends can justify the means. And what Alinsky says in his book, Rules for Radicals, which I read very carefully because I gave a presentation on it recently, he said that as Machiavelli was writing and doing what he did on behalf of the haves, I'm doing what I'm doing on behalf of the have-nots. So, in other words, he viewed himself as a champion of the poor and so forth. And it was interesting, by the way, as I was doing my research, I found a classic interview that William F. Buckley Jr. did on his program Firing Line of Saul Alinsky from 1967. And, in fact, in my presentation, I was able to just use just a couple of short clips. But you see this cynical attitude on the part of Saul Alinsky. Let's do whatever it takes in order to get our viewpoint along, advance, even if that means engaging in the politics of personal destruction. Here's a direct quote from Rules for Radicals. In a fight, almost anything goes. It almost reaches the point where you stop to apologize if a chance blow lands above the belt, end quote.
Yes.
So, and by the way, there's a lot of humor in that book, but the overall message is not funny. He says, for example, treat opponents not as persons, but as symbols representing interests or ideas which he believes inimical to the welfare of the people. So you look at something like that, and then you have the example of Robert Bork, who was, according to some, the most well-qualified potential Supreme Court nominee to come down the pike in decades. He was a Yale law professor and so forth, Robert Bork was, and yet Senator Ted Kennedy got up there in the Capitol in the Senate, and he said Robert Bork's America is a land in which women would be forced into back alley abortions, blacks would sit at segregated lunch counters, rogue police could break down citizens' doors at midnight raids, school children could not be taught about evolution, writers and artists could be censored at the whim of the government, and the doors of the federal courts would be shut on the fingers of millions of citizens. Whoa.
Yeah.
Ed Meese, whom I quote in this piece, he was talking about how he was there in the Reagan administration. He was serving as the Attorney General, and he said Robert Bork was so well qualified, we just didn't expect the personal smear job that was waged against him, including examples like I just read from Ted Kennedy. Whether those people, including Ted Kennedy, used their copy of Rules for Radicals and it was out of their page book. And it doesn't matter. It's the same idea. It's the same notion of the politics of personal destruction, destroying somebody. It's like the old Krauthammer statement. The left, we think the left is wrong. The left thinks we are evil.
Yeah. Well, and I remember that battle because I was broadcasting back then, and I remember somebody calling in and saying, we need to write letters to the Supreme Court. And back in 1986, it seemed like, well, that's not right. 86 and 87, no. I mean, and of course, then shortly thereafter, Ted Kennedy gave that famous speech about Robert Bork's America. And ever since, these nominations have been so controversial. So let me, first of all, Jerry, encourage people to go to your website, jerrynewcombe.com. And, of course, they can also go to the information available there that will get them to D. James Kennedy's Ministries. They can find out more about your books and all the various articles that you have written over the years. And we certainly appreciate you joining us and giving us a little bit of time today here on Point of View.
Oh, absolutely. Thank you, Kerby.
And it's been fun to be on your radio program as well. So we need to take a break. When we come back, we're going to kind of change topics, and that is we feel that there is an issue that the mainstream press has not been covering, and that is the incredible amount of persecution taking place with Christians. Now, I have a commentary coming out next week on Nigeria, but we'll be talking next with Pastor Bob Roberts about what is happening to Christians facing genocide in Burma or Myanmar. So we're going to be looking at what is happening in Africa, what is happening in Asia. Of course, look at what is happening in these Muslim countries all around the world, and even what's happening in North Korea. It is a very significant human rights issue. You aren't probably hearing very much about it, if anything, by the mainstream media, but we cover it because we are concerned about our fellow brothers and sisters in Christ, so we're going to do that as well. And then, as I mentioned, in the next hour, Jay Cost with us. The Price of Greatness, Alexander Hamilton and James Madison. We've posted one of his really good articles on these founders of our country. Matter of fact, two of whom were writers of the Federalist Papers. And so I thought it would be good to educate you about that. And, of course, it relates back to some of the confirmation hearings that we'll be talking about here on Point of View as well. All of it available on our website, pointofview.net. We'll take a break. I'll be back with more right after this.
With the way things are going right now, there's got to be a source of truth somewhere.
Eric lives in California, and he's listened to Point of View since he was a child hanging around his dad's auto shop in Nevada. He says it's his only trustworthy source of information about what's happening in the world.
Well, I feel bad because I have not been donating, and I'll tell you what, I'm getting back to that because just recently I realized with all the junk going on with all the media, with all these news things, the only one that I count on is you guys, and what would I do if you guys weren't there? I don't know what I'd do. Where would I get my news? And I would be dead in water. So I got to do my part.
Make sure you do your part, like Eric. Join the Truth Team. Get all the details by calling 1-800-347-5151 or visit online, pointofview.net/team. Support the truth and make a difference for the future. 800-347-5151 and pointofview.net/team. 800-347-5151 and pointofview.net/team. Point of View will continue after this.
are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
So often we talk about the fact that there are some very important stories that just aren't covered by the mainstream media. This week, of course, almost all the attention paid to the Helsinki discussions and the backlash and the reactions and all of that. Certainly important. Of course, we have an upcoming confirmation hearing for Brett Kavanaugh, as we just talked about a minute ago. But there is a story or two about persecuted Christians that we are convinced needs to be covered. And if you listen to this broadcast, you know I've talked a little bit about what is Nigerian genocide, and we'll talk more about that in just a minute. But another story is what is happening to Christians facing genocide in Burma, oftentimes referred to as Myanmar. So to give us some perspective, first of all, we've posted an article about this on our website, pointofview.net, and to educate us a little bit more on this issue, we go to Bob Roberts, who is the co-chair of the Faith Coalition to Stop Genocide in Burma, also the founding pastor of Northwood Church in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, and individual that has been involved in church planting and really has a heart for what is happening to believers there. So, Bob, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Thank you, Kerby, for caring enough to have me here.
Well, let's, if we can, tell the story. There's probably just a need for you to give us a little bit of a background. I know that certainly some of my staff have been to Burma, but for a lot of people, they may not even know where that is. They may not know about what is happening there with the Muslims and the Burmese military. So kind of educate us for a few minutes, if you might.
All right. Well, if you give me a few minutes to educate you, then the essence is this. Most people have never been to the Rakhine State, where the Rohingya Muslims are, or the Kachin State, where the Christians are. The reason is the Rakhine State is far west, and the Kachin State is about as far north as you can get, and it's boxed in by India and China. But Burma was like many other countries that the British had when they drew the boundaries. They deliberately drew them through tribes and so forth to keep those countries somewhat destabilized so they could also always have a footprint there. So Burma was no different. In 1960 or so, it got its independence. It was made up 60% of the Burma people, which are Burmese, and you had some of these other tribes that were out on the fringes and the edges of these areas. And it was like the first, and Aung San Suu Kyi, her father, wanted to build it like the United States. And so the U.S. got on board. There were going to be 10 or 12 states. The Kachin was going to be a state, the Korean, and so forth and so on. It was an opportunity for them to work together. They were independent countries with their own armies. But a year into office, they killed him and his entire cabinet, and the military took over and has been in control ever since. As a result, those people that are on the fringes of Burma have always faced clashes, a little bit of civil war, some challenges and so forth. But in the past 7 years, it's become incredibly intense. And it's what the UN is now calling ethnic cleansing. Nikki Haley has taken a strong stand, as has Ambassador Sam Brownback. I'm so grateful Vice President Pence is also aware and making overtures to challenge that whole situation. And so what happened 7 years ago was that the military was trying to go ahead and push people through, push them out. And so they activated or built up the 33rd and 99th battalions. And they started going into the Kachin State primarily, the Korean State as well, but especially the Rakhine State. That's where the Muslims are, what we call the Rohingyas. So they've been doing persecution and pushing them out, but about a year and a half ago, they pushed in earnest. And so in March, I visited what is the largest refugee camp in the world. And it's horrible, Kerby. It's squalor. It's open sewage. The stories you hear of rape, murder. I met mothers who watched their kids thrown in fires. Husbands who watched their wives raped before them by men and physical instruments, horrible things. Moms who watched their kids dismembered. They're trained in these tactics of genocide. And so we have the situation that we do now, and everyone's heard about the Rohingya. Sadly, they've not heard about the Kachin. And the reason is the Kachin are just extremely north. if you looked at a map at Burma, you would see by the outline. And whereas the Muslims can go over into Bangladesh because the Muslims give haven to one another, they can't. The Christians can't go into China. They can't go into India. And the first thing, it's difficult to get there, but I was able to get in. And the first thing that they asked me, it just broke my heart, Bob, where's the American church? Kerby, you may find it interesting to know that these are the direct spiritual descendants of Adoniram Judson, the first American missionary from the West in the 1830s who went over there. It's a state of 1.7 million people, 1.7 million, and believe it or not, 95% of them are Christian. There's probably nowhere else like this in the world, 95%. And the overwhelming majority of those are Baptist. And so you have what's called the Kachin Baptist that is there. And so because they're isolated, it's hard to get there. Media can't get there. There's not a border close by that would cooperate like Bangladesh would do to let people go back and forth. But because of that, no one's hearing what's going on. And about 6 to 8 months ago, they transferred the 33rd and 99th Battalion from the Rakhine State because they were getting so much pushback from the international community, and they put them now in the Kachin State. So already, tragically, people are being raped and murdered. When I was there, you could hear the jets, you could hear the helicopters. I met with refugees, the same thing, death. It's not yet reached the level of the Rohingya, but there is literally nothing to stop that from happening. So it's serious. And Burma is a Buddhist country. Of all the religions in the world, the least likely religion that ever goes to war with anyone would be the Buddhist. But it's first about ethnic cleansing and then religion. And that's very important to understand. So what they want is a pure Burmese state. Well, there's nowhere for these people to go. So right now, there's at least 150,000 refugees, maybe more. It's hard to count them. Everything's in flux right now. So any number that I give you is growing. It could be grossly inaccurate. And what they did, they started on the outer edges of the Kachin State, and they're pushing the people towards the middle. And so they're taking all this land over where they've got minerals and other things. They've destroyed 450 villages, 60 in the last few months. They've bombed or burned over 60 churches, put pagodas on about 20 of those, because you've got to understand the church is the center of life for those people. And so when they destroy the church, it destroys those people. And so it's very severe right now.
Let me just mention that we have a couple of resources. First of all, we have an article here, 60 churches burned or bombed, talking about the Kachin Christians facing genocide in Burma. We have a link to faithcoalition.org, and there is a video there that you can watch, which is about 3 minutes long, that gives a first-hand account. Also a number of pictures, some action items, and I would encourage you to maybe take that particular link and send it to maybe your missions pastor at church or to educate some other people about this issue. But as you point out, the same Burmese military units that were in Rakhine are now in the Kachin State, and so we're going to try to educate people about that. But just before we take a break, Bob, let's start talking about action items. What can people do? You've heard me already suggest that people can go to the website, they can watch the video, they can pass some of that information on. They may even click that video so they can put it on a Facebook page or something like that. Or there's some other action items you might have for us?
Yeah, and you just started it. Why don't I give you a list of four, and we can come back after your break and talk about it. Number one, make people aware. Number two, make your congressman and senator aware. Number three, you can send money to the Kachin Baptist Convention, and that sounds like a strange thing to do, but I'll explain that in a minute, why it's a critical thing to do. And then the fourth thing I would say is, and we can't take this lightly, we need to get on our face before God and pray for them every single day, because they're facing serious and severe persecution right now.
Well, let's take a break. And Raymond Ibrahim has said that Christians are the most persecuted people in the world. And you might even see his latest Prager University video. And of course, we've spent some time talking about what's happening in Nigeria, which has a similar situation where you have the Muslims in the north, Christians more in the south. But again, there is ethnic cleansing taking place there and an attempt to have religious cleansing. So whether we look at Nigeria in Africa, whether we look at Burma in Southeast Asia, or many other countries, we are dealing with just an incredible concern that has been pretty much ignored by the mainstream media. But we won't ignore that here on Point of View. When we come back, we're going to continue our conversation with Bob Roberts. He'll fill in some of the details there on some of the action items for you. So let's take a break. We'll come back with him right after this.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. Evelyn Shatkin, Linda Shiflett, and Doug Maples took prayer seriously. So seriously, in fact, that they decided to meet together after work and pray for a colleague that had been causing them problems. They met at the cubicle of their colleague after work on a day that she was not even in the office. Their prayer got pretty serious. They anointed the cubicle with oil, according to Shatkin's religious tradition. They prayed for peace and joy for their colleague. They even commanded demons to leave their colleague as they prayed. Word got back to the supervisors about the after-hours prayer meeting, and after an investigation, the supervisor concluded that, quote, the nature, the manner that they're praying, what language they're using, determines whether the prayer was harassment. Human Resources agreed and notified the prayer givers that they would be terminated for their harassing prayers. Shatkin and Shiflett asked for a religious accommodation for the prayers, but that was denied. They were fired. First Liberty Institute took up their case. A federal district court sided with the employees as it concluded, quote, can a prayer for someone constitute harassment when the alleged object of the prayer is unaware of it? This court suspects not, unquote. In fact, the court concluded that the college's own policies protected the prayers of these employees. Firing someone for their peaceful exercise of religion at work doesn't have a prayer. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
You can learn how to protect religious freedom in the workplace, public schools, your church, the military, and more by downloading First Liberty's free Religious Liberty Protection Kits at firstliberty.org. That's firstliberty.org. If you want hope for religious freedom, go to firstliberty.org.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
It says that, again, Christians are the most persecuted people on earth, and you can read about that in Jihad Watch as well as in his Prager University video, and we'll probably get him on to talk about persecuted Christians around the world, but focusing our time and attention for a few more minutes at least on what is happening in Burma. And in this particular case, not only, of course, were the Christians persecuted, but, Bob, it's worth mentioning at least that when we talk about the Rohingya, we're talking about Muslims, and they were actually chased from their villages by the Burmese. And that, I think, actually became the largest mass migration of a people group in modern history, about 700,000. So in this particular case, the military has been persecuting and attacking and engaged in genocide both of Christians and Muslims, hasn't it?
It has. And that's what makes this faith coalition so exciting that I worked with many years ago. I'm a Baptist and an evangelical, and I care about religious freedom. And because of some unique circumstances of some countries where I've worked, I started teaming up with Muslims and others to stand up for Christians. And it went incredible because people don't realize it, but frankly, Muslims sometimes are more persecuted by their own people than anyone else.
Oh, yeah.
And so it opened doors that we could do it together. And so when this came open, me and Imam Majid Mohammed, who's the imam who prayed at President Trump's interfaith service, we tackled it together. And so he's using the full weight of Muslim leaders to stand up with us. So this has never happened before, and we're excited about it. And it's frankly enabled us to raise a lot of resources and push it forward.
You know, my recent book on Islam and terrorism, I talk about the fact that the greatest threat to a Muslim is usually another Muslim. So again, you can see that to be the case.
True.
But let's, before we run out of time, Bob, talk about some of those action items again, because I really want to see what we can do through this broadcast to mobilize the church and mobilize all sorts of Christians across the country to educate the people in their congregations and to also maybe pass this on to a minister or pastor that didn't have a chance to hear this broadcast today.
Well, I think, Kerby, understanding media like you do, you get it. The number one thing we do when we post things on social media, we tweet them, we put them on Facebook, we make people aware, we tell the stories, pastors using the stories of what's happening in sermon illustrations, it raises that awareness. So I think that has to be the first thing. The second thing that I would say is we've got to make our congressmen and senators known. There's a big debate about Aung San Suu Kyi. I mean, as you know, she won the Nobel Peace Prize. So in 2015, when she came in power, the thought was, well, you know, she's going to change everything. Well, she didn't. And so some people believe that her hands are tied. Other people believe that she's become complicit. I don't know. But what we do know is thousands of people are dying, and we now have to respond. So gratefully, the House has come up with a bill and passed it. The Senate, believe it or not, came up with a bipartisan bill, and they've given it to Speaker McConnell without prejudice, which means it could be voted on immediately, and it would be unanimous. But Speaker McConnell is good friends with Aung San Suu Kyi on Senate Bill 2060. He will not bring that forward because he's concerned that, you know, maybe she's trying to do something and it would undermine her. And I understand his concern. But at this point, when thousands of people are losing their lives, you can't do anything. So I would encourage you, please call your senator and encourage them to respond to Senate Bill 2060. When President Obama in 2015 saw Aung San Suu Kyi come into power, he did away with all the sanctions, every single one of them. And the whole international community and the NGOs that work there discouraged him from doing that. They said, look, don't go too fast. Let's take time, because these even give some leverage for Aung San Suu Kyi with the government. But he did it anyhow. And so we're asking President Trump to put those back in place, minus food and medicine. So if you could call your senator on that. The third thing is many people like Franklin Graham and World Vision, Samaritan's Purse, and others are working in Cox's Bazar, where the refugee camp is. You cannot get to Kachin. It's just near impossible because of the roads. You have to fly in, and that's controlled by the government. So it's not like a church can send a volunteer group or NGOs can get in there easily. So as crazy as this sounds, the best thing financially, if you want to help, is send money to the Kachin Baptist Convention. You can send that to thefaithcoalition.org has a donate button. My organization, GlocalNet, Glocal, GLOCAL.net. You can send it here. We're sending every dime straight there. We're not taking anything for that. But money is the biggest thing they need. And sadly, they just passed a law that the Baptist churches could no longer take care of the refugees. Well, that's problematic because they're the only ones that are taking care of the refugees. I don't care if your church is 100 or 200 or 500, you're going to have between 500 and 2,000 refugees on your church property. So they desperately need money. for food. I visited those churches. I visited the IDP camps and saw it firsthand. And then the fourth thing is you just can't minimize prayer. I know people say, oh, don't say pray for me. That's not a big deal. It is a big deal. It is a big deal because God hears our prayers, and that's how miracles happen. So those four things, those four actions are just huge. And if we could encourage every single follower of Jesus to do that, it would help us.
Let me again give you a sense of how to get some of this information, since a lot of it probably came fast and furious. As you go to our website, we have a link to faithcoalition.com, and click on the button that says action. There's a good action item there. It then allows you to contact your two senators, your representative, has the Capitol switchboard and all those things. Then it has information about Senate Bill 2060 and House Resolution 4223 on the sanctions, so that if you find yourself saying, well, this all came real quickly, this is kind of new to me, I don't know what to do, and I don't know where to take the first step, all of it is available at faithcoalition.org. And again, we can all pray for what is happening. We should be educated about this, and I hope that you'll take the time to maybe put a link. You can do this by going to faithcoalition.org and posting one of the pictures, or I would encourage you to just, since there's a Vimeo video there, it's about 3 minutes long, just click that share button, put it on your Facebook page, put on Twitter post, maybe send it by email to your pastor, your missions pastor, somebody like that, and that will be a way to take some action. So, Bob Roberts, I appreciate you giving us some time today out of your busy day to once again focus our attention on persecuted believers, but especially today to educate us about what has been happening in Burma. So thank you for joining us today.
Kerby, thank you for your work. Very grateful for you, your program, and your willingness to speak up for the Kachin. Thank you, sir.
Again, you can find information about this on the website. Matter of fact, you might also want to post this article that we have posted here. Comes from cbn.com. And then, of course, my commentary coming out next week on a different issue, and that has to do with the genocide right now of believers in Nigeria. About 60,000 people, mostly women and children, that have been murdered by the Muslim Fulani herdsmen, and an issue that has really gotten the attention not only of our president, but when the Nigerian president was with President Trump back in, I guess it was April, they've spoken out on this issue. And to be give some credit, there have been some articles that have appeared in like The Stream or Christian Post or Breitbart News or something like that. But these tragedies, these human rights tragedies, certainly are not being covered, and that's why we wanted to cover those today here on Point of View. When we come back from the break, sit back and maybe pay attention to our history. We're going to talk about Alexander Hamilton and James Madison, this new book by Jay Costa, and we've posted one of his articles on Hamilton, Madison, and the Paradox at America's Heart. We also have some other great material there as well. The Declaration of Independence, more radical than we might imagine. All that coming up right after this.
Why should you become a partner with Point of View Radio? Because for decades, this team has made a significant difference in lives and communities across the nation. Because America is dying for lack of biblical wisdom about life and culture. You should give because your gift will make possible cutting-edge information on issues that matter, information you won't hear anywhere else. Why? Because your gift will change lives, because you'll influence our culture with biblical truth, and because you can make a difference for the future. Our nation needs a truth team very badly. Support Point of View Radio today at pointofview.net. Click on Join the Truth Team and choose your level of support. Pointofview.net. Or call 800-347-5151, 800-347-5151, or mail that first donation to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221, Box 30, Dallas 75221. Point of View will continue after this.
I I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of view, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
This hour, we're going to spend some time talking about American history. And about a month ago, I saw a really good piece that appeared in National Review by Jay Cost entitled Hamilton, Madison, and the Paradox at America's Heart. And it was all about his new book, The Price of Greatness: Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and the Creation of American Oligarchy. So I thought, well, that's a good piece. I'm going to do some commentaries on it. And I thought, I'm going to buy the book. And then I even told my son-in-law, who's a lawyer and has 2 PhDs, one in American history where he's taught that, why doesn't he get the book as well? So when the book arrived, I said, we got to see if it's even possible we could put him on Point of View and educate all of us about this issue. And it is just a great opportunity to bring Jay Cost to the microphone today. Individual that has been a visiting scholar at the American Enterprise Institute, probably best known as the senior writer at the Weekly Standard. Also has written for the Wall Street Journal, National Review, commentary, a number of others, but and an individual that also, interestingly enough, holds a PhD in political philosophy from the University of Chicago and has done us a great service of helping us understand 2 individuals with very different views for America, which in many cases is being played out today. So, Dr. Cost, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Thanks so much for having me. It's a real pleasure to be here.
One of the things that is kind of interesting is because of that 2004 biography by Ron Chernow, you've had a lot of people interested in Alexander Hamilton. Of course, you have the Broadway play or musical Hamilton. As a matter of fact, my producer was just talking about having an ability to get tickets to that. So we are sort of getting a revival in which people are paying attention to James Madison and Alexander Hamilton. And at a time when we're trying to figure out where America goes in the 21st century, I think your book arrived at a very propitious time.
Oh, well, thank you very much. I appreciate that. Yeah, it's nice to see Hamilton finally get his due. He had been really kind of forgotten for over 100 years as a founding father. He ended up being on the, he died, was assassinated or killed in a duel in 1804, and his political opponents really kind of ended up taking over the country, and his reputation had really sunk until relatively recently. So it's really nice to see Hamilton finally be appreciated once more as the really brilliant founding father that he was.
Well, I want to get into the idea of self-government and republicanism and a variety of other issues, but for just a minute, let's just give a brief overview for both of those individuals, because if you read the Federalist Papers, and when I was at Georgetown, that was one of the things we had to read almost with the same kind of scrutiny that you'd read the Bible. Most of those were written by Alexander Hamilton, many others written by James Madison, and then a few written by John Jay, although because he was sick didn't write as many. But these are 2 individuals that in some respects, just because of their presence at the Constitutional Convention, being around people like George Washington and Benjamin Franklin and others, certainly were key. And yet, as you point out, sometimes they get ignored over time because we focus on other individuals. And yet, if you really want to understand why the Constitution is the way it is, I would recommend that you want to read the Federalist Papers by Alexander Hamilton and James Madison, don't you think?
I do. Madison and Hamilton were both born in the 1750s. So Madison was born in 1751. Hamilton was born in 1756. Now, if you compare the two of them to, Thomas Jefferson was born in the 1740s and George Washington was born in the 1730s. Benjamin Franklin was born even earlier, so was John Adams and Samuel Adams. So Hamilton and Madison are both young men. They're in this sort of the second generation of the founding. And they're too young. Both of them are too young to be involved in the lead up to independence. But Madison is not physically. He's only 5 foot 4 inches and 120 pounds.
Mm-hmm.
He's really no kind of soldier. Hamilton ends up being George Washington's aide de camp, but doesn't take a leadership role in the military, something like a Nathaniel Greene or something like that. So the two of them are really, I don't want to say second-tier founders, but just sort of chronologically, I suppose they were. So they're easy to overlook. It's easy to sort of look at them or sort of look at George Washington and Thomas Jefferson and miss the two of them. But you're right. They had a very crucial role in not so much in bringing about the revolution, but securing the revolution, which is what the Constitution did.
Yeah, I like to make a distinction between the founders and the framers, and in some respects they were more the framers. Well, if we can, for just a few minutes, since I think many people know something about Hamilton, if nothing else because of the musical, he was unusual in the sense that he was not born in this country, and yet nevertheless came from a rather difficult set of circumstances to be fairly successful. Tell the rest of the story, if you might.
Yeah, well, so he was born in very unfortunate circumstances. He was an illegitimate child, born in the Caribbean. His mother dies when he's very young, but he is a very, very bright individual, and he gets a job as a clerk. And his fellow islanders on the island of Nevis take up a collection basically to send him to King's College in New York, which is present-day Columbia. And he immigrates to New York and joins the revolutionary cause. And Hamilton, being Hamilton, is very quickly discovered basically by George Washington, who appreciates how essential he is. And so Hamilton ends up serving as Washington's aide de camp, and simultaneously in the process of that really ends up sort of educating himself on matters of public finance and develops a very nationalistic outlook on the future of the country, having seen the difficulties of mobilizing a military force among the 13 often fractious states. So Hamilton becomes a key leader of the push for a stronger national union after the Treaty of Paris is signed in 1783, and the country is internationally recognized.
Well, and again, very important kind of background to Alexander Hamilton. We're going to get into the National Bank and some of that and where he and Madison disagree, but I have one of those mandatory breaks. When we come back, we'll talk a little bit about James Madison as well. As you said, born in 1751 in a family with kind of a fairly large estate in Virginia. Went to the College of New Jersey, and anybody that's listened to some of my presentations, we've talked about that today, is present-day Princeton. And really was influenced by somebody that we've talked about before, and that is the individual who was the president, but also a Scottish Presbyterian minister by the name of John Witherspoon. And many people think that a lot of that Calvinism caused James Madison to consider the need for us to have checks and balances. And if you read Federalist Paper number 10 or Federalist Paper number 51, you would certainly come to some of that conclusion. And then we'll talk about, of course, Alexander Hamilton, who also wrote about the judiciary, and at a time when we talk about the confirmation of another Supreme Court justice, a lot of people go back to Federalist Paper number 78 and others. So there's just a lot of things that, even though we'll be talking about what happened in the 18th century, are very relevant to some of the debates we're having today in the 21st century, which is why I certainly do recommend this book, which I went out and bought, and my son-in-law did as well, and I think you should, because it is published by Basic Books. You probably can find it in your local bookstore, but we have a link to jcost.com. We've got information about the book there, and of course we've also got a place for you to order it. And of course we've posted this article that appeared in National Review, Hamilton, Madison, and the Paradox at America's Heart. We'll be right back.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Your children are facing an onslaught of profanity through the media. Movies are one place where profanity reigns. One survey has been tracking profanity in movies from the first swear word on film, the 1939 Gone with the Wind, to The Wolf of Wall Street, which holds the record with 798 swear words. There has been a 500% increase over these many decades. The Parents Television Council has documented that the fact that the number of expletives on television programs has doubled in just the last decade. Kids and adults use more profanity simply because they hear it more than ever before. So let's start with a definition. The word profane means to treat something that is sacred with abuse or contempt. It means to desecrate. Something profane is unholy. It is certainly not a positive attitude. So what does the Bible teach? Well, Paul says in Ephesians 4:29, do not let any unwholesome talk come out of your mouths, but only what is helpful for building others up according to their needs. Colossians 3:8 says, rid yourselves of all such things as these: anger, rage, malice, slander, and filthy language from your lips. You know, sometimes we hear young people say that it really doesn't matter what you say, it's only words. Well, words make a difference. Make a joke in public about hijacking a plane and see if words have consequences. As believers, we should submit our vocabularies to the Lord. The world is watching us. Peter admonishes us to keep our behavior excellent among the Gentiles, so that in the thing in which they slander you as evildoers, they may, because of your good deeds, as they observe them, glorify God in the day of visitation. In a world awash in profanity, Christians should watch what they say. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Take Kerby and the Point of View team with you on the go with the Point of View app. Search for Point of View Radio at the Apple or Google Play stores.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Privileged to have with us today Jay Costin. Again, he is the author of this new book, The Price of Greatness, Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and the Creation of American Oligarchy. It's published by Basic Books, over 200 pages. And again, if you'd like to know more about that, we have a link, first of all, to a way in which you could order the book. Again, it is available both in hardcover and Kindle, eventually probably even in paperback. And then we also have a link to jcost.com for more information about him and the book and other resources. And Jay, let's, if we can, come back. I talked a little bit about James Madison, but you probably can do a better job of giving us some education about an individual that also was very important and is oftentimes referred to as the architect of the Constitution.
Yes, Madison was, like we discussed before the break, born in 1751, and so he's really kind of in college when the major events that lead up to the American Revolution begin to happen. So things like the Stamp Act, and he really doesn't have much of an interest in politics, frankly, until the Boston Tea Party and the so-called Intolerable Acts of 1774 really activates something inside of him, and he moves very quickly from that point. He gets elected to the Virginia legislature, where he falls into the orbit of a governor that you might have heard of, Thomas Jefferson.
Yes.
And Madison is really distinguishes himself almost from the very beginning as being an advocate for religious liberty, and particularly what was going on in Virginia during this period is you have the established Church of Virginia was the Anglican Church, the Church of Virginia, and the government was really sort of prosecuting religious minorities, particularly the Baptists that had sort of the Baptist movement that had come about as a consequence of the Great Awakening.
Right.
And Madison is he grows up in the Anglican Church, but he goes to the College of New Jersey, which is run, as you said, by John Witherspoon, who was a Presbyterian. And one of the reasons for that is that he was really put off by the loose morals and kind of corrupt attitude and sort of the laxity of the Anglican-run College of William and Mary. So he's an Anglican, but he's not really a very good Anglican. He has a lot of sympathy for Baptist minorities, and it's Madison and Jefferson who really begin the push for religious liberty in the state of Virginia to disestablish the Anglican Church and make sure that people are free to follow their consciences and worship God as their consciences dictate.
And again, that's important because we so often talk about religious liberty with Kelly Shackelford and Jay Sekulow and others, and we go oftentimes back to individuals like James Madison. Let's, if we can, though, if we don't want to run out of time, talk about the things that Madison and Hamilton agreed about. Early on in your book, you talk about three. First, a commitment to liberal government. By that, the liberal idea was this idea of individual rights and what was actually described in the Declaration of Independence as unalienable rights. And both Madison and Hamilton believe that we have unalienable rights that were endowed to us by our Creator.
Yeah, that's right. This was a general consensus that was widely held at the time, the idea that government was primarily created by free and equal human beings for the protection of their rights. So above all, the right to property. This was just sort of an essential kind of understanding that really linked all Americans and really most people in the English-speaking world. I mean, it's important to bear in mind that the American Revolution was, in many respects, a conservative revolution because it was really about the colonists arguing that their rights as Englishmen, as subjects of the British Crown, had been violated, and they had been left with no recourse but to declare their independence.
And so that was the first one. The other one was this idea of what's called republicanism or self-government, and that is, again, something which we take for granted. But when you assume that King George, the crown, the parliament had the rights, this idea of self-government, it itself was a pretty radical idea, wasn't it?
Yes, this is where the American colonists were more radical. Self-governance or republicanism, I think, is kind of a nebulous concept, but Abraham Lincoln, I think, sums it up well in the Gettysburg Address. Government of the people, by the people, and for the people. And the really big giant leap that the colonists and then the Americans make is eliminating a hereditary monarchy, right? So the people alone are the fount of sovereignty because in England, the people ruled through the House of Commons, but they ruled in conjunction with the British sovereign, who was a hereditary monarch and claimed direct authority from God. And the American Revolution was radical in the sense that it got rid of the notion of a hereditary sovereign and instead founded governmental authority solely on the people.
And again, I might point you to a July 2nd commentary by Jay Koss called "The Declaration of Independence was more radical than any of the men who signed it." And so we'll talk about that maybe a little bit later if we have some time. But the first point was, of course, this idea of liberal government. Second of all, in terms of republicanism. By the way, all those terms have been redefined, but again, those were the original terms. But the third was that they were nationalist, and you've already sort of alluded to that a little bit, and that is especially Alexander Hamilton, but I think James Madison as well, felt that this is just not working. 13 independent states, even under the Articles of Confederation, it didn't work. And so if you wanted to actually promote the ideas of liberalism and republicanism, that's only going to be secured if you have a national government.
That's right. And sitting in the background here is an anxiety that not just that the government isn't working, right? That the national government is basically can't do anything. And so the 13 state governments are in charge. They're really not well-run governments. They oppress political minorities. They interfere with the rights and privileges of each other. So one of the key anxieties in the background here of men like Madison and Hamilton is that it's only a matter of time before the 13 states actually turn against each other and we get, wars on the North American continent like what Europe had been plagued by. And additionally, or I should say relatedly, is that the European powers were still operating within the North American continent. You have England to the north and in the old Northwest. You have Spain in control of Florida. You have the French around as well. And there was an anxiety that the United States, unless they forged a stronger union, would just be manipulated persistently, the 13 states being manipulated by these European powers and being made to sort of dance the tune that's called by Europe.
Yes. And when we come back from the break, I certainly want to focus on the places where Madison and Hamilton disagreed. But since we're talking about that, another term I might put on the table for just a few minutes, and we do have about 2 minutes left. You had the Federalist and the Anti-Federalist. Now, they agreed in the principles here of liberalism and republicanism, but they disagreed as to kind of what you might say the nature of the Union. The Anti-Federalists were saying, look, we just got rid of the Crown. We just got rid of England. We don't want to have another national government. So Patrick Henry, whoever you might want to pick, have some difficulties there. So they agreed on the goal, that is liberalism, republicanism, self-government, individual rights, but they disagreed about how strong the national government should be, because at least some of them did not want to repeat what they just had thrown off in a revolution.
Yeah, that's right. And there were very prominent anti-federalists. James Monroe, 5th President of the United States. You mentioned Patrick Henry, and also Governor George Clinton of New York, who ends up being vice president. So very, very prominent anti-federalists, but also it sort of suggests the reconciliation that happens after the Constitution, right, where the anti-federalists don't become like insurgents or insurrectionists. Like the debate between the Federalists and Anti-Federalists is actually really pretty civil. And so the Constitution, insofar as it was a revolution, it was not a revolution that ate its own. Very important development for the long-term stability of the United States of America. So the Anti-Federalists were welcomed back into the fold, and the disagreement was heated but respectful and ultimately civil.
Yeah, a civil dialogue. What a concept. We need some of that today. Let's take a break. When we come back, we will get into the disagreements. And these are not only 18th century disagreements, some of those surface even to this day. What about Hamilton's idea of national vigor and a strong national government and a national bank even? What about Madison's idea of a Republican balance? And so we're trying to help you understand that some of the tension and the paradox and the disagreement that surfaced even in the latter part of the 18th century is really still part of our political debate today. But we need to take a break, and if you'd like to know a little bit more about this new book, The Price of Greatness, Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and the Creation of American Oligarchy, probably find it in your local bookstore, but if not, we have information about that on our website. We also have a link to jcost.com, and there's information there as well, including many of his articles, some of which, of course, we've posted on our website today, Point of View. Let's take a break. We'll come back with more right after this.
Point of View turned life right side up for Emily's children. Emily listens in Illinois. She and her husband blissfully sent their children off each day to what she called our small, quaint public school, until Point of View led them to watch the documentary Indoctrination. She said, "We came to realize the need for us to educate our children at home. We want their education to be built on the solid foundation of Scripture." Emily said that would not have happened were it not for Point of View's bold consistency of shining light on public education. Your support for Point of View changes the future for children like Emily's. It leads people to start schools and ministries and businesses that change lives. How has the Truth Team impacted you? Please invest to bring truth to other families like Emily's. Support Truth today. Visit pointofview.net/team or call 1-800-347-5151. 800-347-5151 and pointofview.net/team. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Continue our conversation today with Jay Koss as we talk about his book, The Price of Greatness, Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and the Creation of American Oligarchy. And Jay, if we can for just a minute, let's focus on the differences between Hamilton and Madison. And in your chapter, you talk about Hamilton's program for really national vigor, but probably the best illustration I can give is just this idea of a national bank. I mean, Thomas Jefferson, for example, didn't really think that a national bank was even allowed in the Constitution, but Alexander Hamilton was looking at the Bank of England creating money and the importance of commerce, and he believed that that should be established. And, of course, as Secretary of Treasury, actually brought it about. But talk about his vision for the government and his vision for this idea of what you call national vigor.
Right. Well, the way to understand where Hamilton is coming from with the bank is to borrow a concept from modern language, which would be basically a public-private partnership is what the national bank represented. So the public side of the bank is that the government would store its tax revenues in the bank, in the vaults of the bank, and also the government would expect the bank to be there to loan the government money in a pinch. And these are very important things the bank offered. But the bank otherwise would be a private entity engaging in private economic ventures owned by private citizen stockholders, right? So Madison has sort of two objections to this. The first is that, hey, this isn't fair for most Americans. The stockholders of the bank are going to be a very narrow slice of the country, mainly from the commercial centers in the Northeast. And because the government is going to store its tax revenues there, it's basically going to be a guaranteed moneymaker. The bank is never going to want for money, so it will be able to make a profit very easily. So how is that fair? And Madison also was worried about the entanglement of public business and private interest.
Yes.
That he did not see this as a one-way street. If the government comes to depend upon the private stockholders of the bank to hold their currency and to loan them money, that gives the stockholders power over the government, that in a Republican form of government really should be held by the people alone. Hamilton, on the other hand, was comfortable with this and was right to recognize the need for an institution like this in the sense that he understood that the wealthy in the country were going to be making a bet on the success of the United States one way or another. And if the government could find a way to sort of effectively capture their self-interest and yoke it to the interests of the good of the entire country, then they would make a bet on the success of the United States. So imagine, for instance, without the bank, the United States government would not be able to borrow money at reasonable rates of interest. I mean, so you could imagine a situation like we had in Greece a couple of years ago where, interest rates are out of control and the government can't borrow money and people lose even more faith in the government, so interest rates go up and you just sort of get this vicious cycle. Hamilton saw a private bank that held public tax revenues as a way to create a virtuous cycle, confidence in the government facilitating lower interest rates and governmental success, and therefore, in the long run, greater confidence in the government.
And again, Madison, as you just pointed out a minute ago, felt that, government should be more like an umpire or a judge or referee or something like that. It shouldn't get involved in some of those activities. And also was really concerned about the fact that it would help the wealthy, but not those who were not landowners, those who were not as entitled and endowed as others. And isn't that just, if nothing else, a kind of a quick summary of some of the conflict we have today over public policy? Because you'll have on one hand individuals that will say, we need to do something with, for example, the most recent tax reform to actually stimulate the economy. But then people say, well, the people that are the primary beneficiaries are those in the upper income tiers in terms of some kind of tax reform. But then you have others that say, yeah, but I've never seen a job created by a person that isn't wealthy. But at the same time, others are saying, well, yeah, but it benefits those who are wealthy, but not. And so it's not like one was right. In some respects, it's the illustration of the clash of values we have even to this very day, don't you think?
Its clash of values, it continues to resonate through to today because these values are inherent in our constitutional structure. I mean, they're all there in the preamble. We, the people of the United States, which is a very Republican statement, in order to form a more perfect union, which is a very nationalistic statement, right? So we, on the one hand, want to be a government of the people, by the people, for the people, so we treat different classes of citizens equitably and without distinction. At least that's what we aspire to. But we also recognize that we want to grow and develop and become a better nation, a more prosperous, a more secure nation. And frankly, that often requires us to play favorites. And, so the reason that I titled the book The Price of Greatness is because there are real trade-offs between becoming a greater nation or more developed, secure, prosperous nation on the one hand, and following through on, again, this idea espoused by Lincoln, a government of the people, by the people, for the people.
Okay, let's get to the subtitle, Oligarchy. You end up with sort of a hybrid here. You've got the economics of Alexander Hamilton. You've got kind of the political civics of James Madison. But you end up with an oligarchy, or you end up at least a few times where that develops. Can you kind of give us some illustrations of that?
Sure. Well, an oligarchy is sort of derived from Greek. It basically means rule by the wealthy, right? And inevitably it comes about because, at least in the American context, if we're going to use certain groups as mediators of the public good, like you talked about tax cuts a little bit ago, those are going to be tax cuts, because we want to create jobs, so they're going to accrue primarily to the wealthy, right? But beyond that, by giving direct benefits to the wealthy, like Hamilton did with the bank, kind of ends up entangling American interests and the interests of the rich. So you see this in, the massive lobbying operations that exist in Washington, D.C. today, usually working on behalf of some very powerful, wealthy interest group. So and it's not just a one-way distribution of benefits or one-sided distribution, but also entanglement of public power and private interest. And, this is, as you suggested, Kerby, this has happened through various points in American history. I think one of the more recent examples would be the illustration of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, where the federal government gets involved in promoting affordable housing, which is a good thing, right? Home ownership is a good thing. If anybody in the audience owns their own home, you appreciate how much more valuable it is to own your own home than to rent. So the federal government gets involved in this and basically starts spreading credit around. But the benefits of it accrue to the stockholders of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, who tend to be very wealthy, and they basically create a political machine in Washington, D.C. that uses campaign contributions and charitable donations and sort of foundation grants to basically create a political machine to make sure that the government doesn't try to reform Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, even after scandalous information had been revealed about dubious accounting practices at the two giant federal credit institutions. And, of course, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac lend with reckless irresponsibility. And when the housing crisis comes in 2008, the two of them go belly up. And they had also contributed to it with their recklessness. And so this is a really, to my mind, this is a really great, relatively recent example of how our noble nationalistic intentions can end up, benefiting the wealthy, distorting our Republican, small r, Republican political process, and ultimately, in some worst-case scenarios, working against our own ambitions to, home ownership was really negatively affected by the housing crisis, which itself was caused by public policies meant to encourage home ownership.
Well, and again, I think I can hear James Madison's voice saying, ambition, corruption, greed, factions, all those kinds of things he talks about as well. And, of course, you even have a chapter on intrigue and corruption, which now, of course, takes us later to the second Bank of America, but nevertheless, some of those illustrations there as well. We need to take a break, and when we come back, though, I thought for just a minute I might chat with you about your other commentary, which is the Declaration of Independence was more radical than any of the men who signed it. If for no other reason than we just, of course, went through a celebration, of course, of this nation's history and of the Declaration, and I thought that would be another aspect of that as well. But as we have been talking about, just some great material that helps us understand some of the clash of values which we run into even to this day that go all the way back between the clash between individuals at one point were friends, later probably almost enemies, Alexander Hamilton and James Madison, individuals that serve the country in different contexts and different situations. And when we come back, we'll continue our conversation for a few more minutes with Jay Cost. If you'd like to know more about him, we have information about him on our website, including his website, jcost.com. We'll be back right after this.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. Evelyn Shatkin, Linda Shiflett, and Doug Maples took prayer seriously. So seriously, in fact, that they decided to meet together after work and pray for a colleague that had been causing them problems. They met at the cubicle of their colleague after work on a day that she was not even in the office. Their prayer got pretty serious. They anointed the cubicle with oil, according to Shatkin's religious tradition. They prayed for peace and joy for their colleague. They even commanded demons to leave their colleague as they prayed. Word got back to the supervisors about the after-hours prayer meeting, and after an investigation, the supervisor concluded that, quote, the nature, the manner that they're praying, what language they're using, determines whether the prayer was harassment. Human Resources agreed and notified the prayer givers that they would be terminated for their harassing prayers. Shatkin and Shiflett asked for a religious accommodation for the prayers, but that was denied. They were fired. First Liberty Institute took up their case. A federal district court sided with the employees as it concluded, quote, can a prayer for someone constitute harassment when the alleged object of the prayer is unaware of it? This court suspects not, unquote. In fact, the court concluded that the college's own policies protected the prayers of these employees. Firing someone for their peaceful exercise of religion at work doesn't have a prayer. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
You can learn how to protect religious freedom in the workplace, public schools, your church, the military, and more by downloading First Liberty's free Religious Liberty Protection Kits at firstliberty.org. That's firstliberty.org. If you want hope for religious freedom, go to firstliberty.org.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Jay Koss with us for just a few more minutes. I might again mention his book, The Price of Greatness, which you can find in your local bookstore. And that has caused us to certainly spend most of our time talking about the Constitution. But Jay, I thought for just a minute, we might go back to the Declaration of Independence. Of course, on the 4th of July, we always love this phrase about the fact that we are endowed by our Creator with certain unalienable rights. But you also, in this piece that came out just recently, said that one thing we overlook is this idea of popular sovereignty. Who should rule the body politic? And in some respects, we've taken that for granted. And yet, if you think about this, when we look at all the opportunities that we have given to individuals over time, in some respects, the unfulfilled promise at the Declaration, but the fulfilling of those promises over time in terms of suffrage and voting rights and all sorts of other rights, a lot of that goes back to this idea of we the people, doesn't it?
Yes, it does. I was inspired to write the piece because I feel like the founders, the authors of the Declaration of Independence are criticized, and in many respects rightly so, for, many of them were slaveholders, and of course this was before women had the right to vote, and voting such as it was usually limited to property ownership. So there was a very narrow cast of people who were considered, citizens in the full sense of the word in 1776. And the Declaration itself does not directly challenge that, but the Declaration unleashes an idea that has really worldwide radical implications, which is that government ultimately is founded upon the free and equal consent of the governed, and that protections or sort of privileges for certain groups of people over other groups of people that are bottomed on the government are illegitimate, that there is to be no ruling, governing elite who occupy the position because of who their parents happen to be. George III is not entitled to any sorts of governing authority that the average American citizen is. This is an idea that is embedded in the Declaration of Independence, and I think it is why so many of the civic revolutions in our country, the abolition of slavery, the suffragette movement, the promotion and expansion of civil and voting rights in the 1960s, all of these movements end up using and sort of appropriating logic and rhetoric and ideas that themselves come from the Declaration of Independence, because that document really unleashed a force into the world that was more transformational than the people who came up with the idea in the first place.
And again, some of that was, to use a phrase that Martin Luther King used, the uncashed checks or the unfulfilled promises. But it did unleash this idea that it is, of course, you've quoted a couple times Abraham Lincoln, of the people, by the people, for the people. But it was the idea that only the people have control over the government. And over time, some of those flaws that were inherent in both the Declaration and the Constitution, because of slavery, because of a number of other issues, eventually began to be resolved. And so in some respects, when people ignore what was a very radical document, that is the Declaration of Independence, as you point out, it was in some respects more radical than any of the men who signed it.
Yeah, and it really puts in the mind of the people, right? The Declaration has a transformational effect on the public consciousness. I mean, I think a great illustration of this is the 19th Amendment, right, which guarantees women the right to vote. And it was passed by a body politic that at that time was completely made up of men. So what men collectively decided to do in the 19 teens was dilute their voting strength by 1/2, by basically doubling the size of the electorate. And they agreed to do this because the suffragette movement grounded its claims for the right to vote in these ideas that had just become the way Americans thought about politics. By grounding it in the notion of equality and liberty and the fact that we all should be free and equal citizens, men volunteered to expand the size of the electorate. It's really an extraordinary thing that happened in the United States of America. And I mean, really, you don't see revolutions like that in world history without any shots having been fired. It's really extraordinary. And I think the credit for that has to go, at least in part, to these ideas that were unleashed by the Declaration, and they take on a force of their own that is above and beyond anything that the original authors probably could ever have envisioned.
Again, just some great material. Let me just again point people to your website, jcost.com. Your most recent one is Wither Civic Virtue. We certainly do need some civility and civic virtue, don't we? And, of course, James Madison spoke to that issue, as, of course, did all of the founders of the Framers in one way or another. So just a lot of great material. But as people go to your website, what's available? Because I would assume that some certainly would want to order the book. Are you ever available for speaking or other opportunities to educate people about American history?
I am, yes, and I'm on Twitter. You can find me on Twitter at jcosttws, and my email address is over at my Twitter site. So if people are interested in having me for speaking engagements, I don't have like a booking agent or anything like that, but I love coming out to speak to people about the Constitution. And to that point, I also have a podcast that I co-host called Constitutionally Speaking, where we basically break down the meaning and history and origins of the Constitution and try and explain in a simple everyday language without dumbing it down for people who really want to understand how our Constitution came into being but are not themselves specialists is sort of our agenda there, which you can find it. We're on the Ricochet Podcast Network, and also it's on iTunes or Stitcher or whatever your podcast podcast audio source is. You can find Constitutionally Speaking there.
And I might mention that as people look at your picture on our website, pointofview.net, we have a link to the Twitter post. If they go to the section there on Jay Cost, we have a link to your email, Twitter, other contact information, and, of course, other books, articles, and resources. So, again, if nothing else, I thought this was such an excellent book, and I first heard about it by reading your piece in the National Review, and continue to enjoy reading you from a weekly basis. So look forward to the next opportunity, and thank you again for writing the book, The Price of Greatness, and thank you for giving us an hour today here on Point of View.
Oh, thank you so much, Kerby. You've been so generous with your time. I really appreciate it.
That's all we have for today, but as you well know, as you listen to Point of View, we really like to educate you about American history, especially focusing on, when we can, on America's godly heritage, and we certainly are the beneficiaries of those who have come before us, and I think it is important from time to time to take a break and spend a little bit of time learning about our history so that we can apply it to our lives today. And as you can see, whether we look at Alexander Hamilton or James Madison, some of the conflict and some of the clash of values that surfaced in the 18th century surface even today. So it's important to understand where those came from. If you'd like to know a little bit more about this book or any other topic that we've addressed, certainly you can go to the website, pointofview.net. I have my viewpoints commentary today. We have the Take Action. We have videos and other resources. So I hope that you will visit the website, pointofview.net. If you can help us out financially, of course, we are dependent upon your financial gifts to bring this program to you. And if you said, boy, I've learned a little bit more about history today that I don't think I would have ever learned if I hadn't tuned in to Point of View, hope you might click on that button that says donate and certainly take the time to support this ministry. If you'd like to listen to it again, of course, you can download the podcast, or you can go to the YouTube channel and watch it and learn and maybe even pass it on to others. So that's all we have for today. We certainly hope that you take the time to visit our website, pointofview.net. I want to also thank Andrew and Stephanie and Steve for their help behind the scenes. Have a great day. We'll see you back here tomorrow on our Friday Weekend Edition.
Why does Kerby Anderson do what he does? Because he believes in God's ability to use you to make a difference.
There's a real need for us to articulate a responsible biblical perspective and to give people an understanding of what is happening in the world, and in addition to educating them, to then empower them to go out and make a difference for Christ.
Together we can push back the growing darkness. It's not going to be easy. But by God's grace, it is happening one person, one community at a time. Join us in this mission. Become a monthly partner. $1 a day, $30 a month will make a huge difference. Or perhaps you can do $100 a month. We need partners of all sizes. We need you. Give today online at pointofview.net. At the top of the page, next to the Donate Now button, click on Become a Monthly Partner. Pointofview.net. Mail your donation to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221, or call 800-347-5151. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.